Some memories are more vivid than the present. Some faces haunt us not because we knew them, but because we almost did. Lieutenant Daniel Harper had never intended to become a war artist. When he'd enlisted in 1943, he packed his sketchbook almost as an afterthought, wedged between a shaving kit and a photo of his parents' farm in Iowa. He'd been studying fine arts at the University of Iowa when Pearl Harbor changed everything. And like so many young men of his generation, he traded his easel for a rifle, his studio for a foxhole. But war, he discovered, had a way of finding your hidden talents and putting them to use in ways you never expected. It started with maps. His commanding officer, Colonel Matthews, had noticed Daniel's precise hand and keen eye for detail during their training exercises. Soon, Daniel found himself sketching terrain features, documenting enemy positions, and creating visual intelligence reports that were far more useful than the standard written accounts. His art had become his weapon, his pencil as vital as his pistol. By the winter of 1944, Daniel was embedded with the 101st Airborne Division, stationed in a bombed-out church in the Belgian countryside. The Gothic windows were long gone, leaving jagged stone frames that framed the gray December sky like broken prayers. It was there, in that sanctuary turned command post, that Daniel first saw her. She appeared like a ghost in the doorway during the evening of December 16th, just as the first reports of German artillery were crackling through the radio. Daniel looked up from his field desk, where he'd been sketching the church's damaged altar, and there she was, a young woman in a tattered coat, her dark hair falling across her face, her eyes wide with the kind of terror that only civilians caught in the crossfire truly understood. "S'il vous plaît," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the distant rumble of approaching tanks. "Aidez-moi." Daniel's French was limited, but he understood enough. "Help me." She couldn't have been more than 20, with delicate features that seemed almost ethereal in the dim light filtering through the broken windows. Her coat was too large for her frame, hanging off her shoulders like borrowed hope. But it was her eyes that captured him, dark, expressive, filled with a mixture of fear and fierce determination that spoke of someone who had already seen too much. "It's all right," Daniel said in halting French, setting down his pencil and rising from his makeshift desk. "You're safe here." But even as he spoke the words, they both knew they were a lie. Nowhere was safe anymore. The Germans were advancing. The Battle of the Bulge was beginning. And this little Belgian village was about to become another casualty of war. Colonel Matthews emerged from the confessional he'd been using as a communication center, his face grim. "Harper, we're pulling out in 30 minutes. Germans are 3 kilometers out and closing fast." Daniel looked at the young woman, who was watching the exchange with obvious understanding despite the language barrier. She knew what was coming. "What about civilians?" Daniel asked. "Not our problem," Matthews replied curtly. "Our orders are to fall back to the secondary position and regroup. Anyone who can't keep up." "Sir," Daniel interrupted, something in his voice making the colonel pause. "She's just a girl." Matthews looked at the young woman, then back at Daniel. For a moment, his expression softened. "War makes civilians of us all. Harper, and soldiers too. Get your gear. We move in 25 minutes." As the unit prepared for evacuation, Daniel found himself unable to focus on packing his equipment. The young woman, he still didn't know her name, had retreated to a corner of the church, sitting on a broken pew with her hands folded in her lap. She watched the soldiers with the careful attention of someone who had learned to read danger in the set of a man's shoulders, the speed of his movements. Something about her stillness, her quiet dignity in the face of abandonment, compelled Daniel to act. He pulled out his sketchbook and a piece of charcoal and began to draw. He worked quickly, capturing the way the pale light caught the curve of her cheek, the slight tilt of her head as she watched the soldiers prepare to leave her behind. There was something timeless about her pose, something that reminded him of the classical paintings he'd studied in school. A modern Madonna in a broken sanctuary, waiting for salvation that might never come. She noticed him drawing, and their eyes met across the nave. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then she smiled, a small, sad expression that somehow managed to convey both gratitude and resignation. It was the smile of someone who understood that she was being seen, truly seen, perhaps for the last time. Daniel added that smile to his sketch, trying to capture not just the curve of her lips, but the emotion behind it. The weight of unspoken words, the acknowledgement of a connection that would be severed in minutes. "Harper," Matthews called out. "Time to go." Daniel looked up to see his unit filing out of the church, their boots echoing off the stone floors. He glanced down at his sketch. It was rough, unfinished, but it captured something essential about the moment. He tore the page from his sketchbook and walked over to the young woman. "For you," he said in English, then tried again in French. "Pour vous." She took the sketch with careful hands, studying it as if she were seeing herself for the first time. When she looked up at him, there were tears in her eyes. "Merci," she whispered. "Comment vous appelez-vous?" "Daniel," he replied, understanding the question, if not the exact words. "Daniel Harper." She nodded, pressing the sketch to her chest. "Merci, Daniel Harper." He wanted to ask her name, wanted to know who she was, where she came from, what had brought her to this moment. But Matthews was shouting for him now, and the sound of German engines was growing closer. "I'm sorry," he said, backing toward the door. "I'm so sorry." She stood up as he left, clutching the sketch in one hand and raising the other in a small wave. It was the last thing he saw before the church door closed behind him. A young woman in a tattered coat, holding a drawing of herself, saying goodbye to a soldier whose name she would remember long after he'd forgotten hers. Or so he thought. The retreat was chaos. Daniel's unit fell back through the Belgian countryside as German forces advanced, the landscape becoming a blur of snow-covered fields and burning villages. They regrouped at a farm 15 kilometers south, where Daniel set up his field desk in a barn that smelled of hay and diesel fuel. But every time he tried to sketch, he found himself drawing the same face. The young woman from the church appeared in his margin notes, in his tactical drawings, in the portraits of his fellow soldiers. Her eyes looked out from dozens of pages, that same expression of quiet dignity mixed with unspoken fear. "Who's the girl?" asked Sergeant Morrison, looking over Daniel's shoulder as he worked on a map of German positions. Daniel looked down at his paper, surprised to find that he'd unconsciously sketched her profile in the corner. "Just someone I saw," he said, erasing the drawing. "Someone we left behind." But Morrison was already walking away, and Daniel was left alone with the weight of that phrase. "Someone we left behind." The words echoed in his mind as he tried to focus on his official duties, but the young woman's face kept appearing in his work, unbidden and unforgettable. Days passed. The unit moved again, then again, following the fluid lines of retreat and advance that characterized the Battle of the Bulge. Daniel dutifully sketched enemy positions, documented troop movements, and created the visual intelligence reports that had become his specialty. But in quiet moments, he found himself returning to that unfinished portrait, trying to capture something he couldn't quite name. It was during a lull in the fighting, while his unit was billeted in a half-destroyed farmhouse, that Daniel overheard a conversation that changed everything. Two Belgian civilians, an elderly man and woman, were speaking with Colonel Matthews through a translator. They had come seeking information about their village, about family members who had been caught behind German lines. The translator, a young corporal named Bouchard who spoke fluent French, was explaining that the military had no information about civilian casualties. "They're asking about their granddaughter," Bouchard said to Matthews. "She was staying with friends in the village we evacuated from. They haven't heard from her since the Germans took it." Daniel looked up from his sketching. "What village?" "The one with the church," Bouchard replied, "where we set up the command post last week." "What was her name?" Daniel asked, his heart beginning to race. Bouchard spoke to the elderly couple in French, then turned back to Daniel. "Marie Dubois. She was 21, dark hair about this tall." He gestured to indicate a height that matched Daniel's memory perfectly. "Marie. Her name was Marie." "Did they?" Daniel's voice caught. "Did they say what happened to her?" Bouchard asked the question in French, and Daniel watched the elderly man's face crumble. The old woman began to cry, soft sounds that seemed to echo the broken prayers of the church where Daniel had last seen their granddaughter. "The Germans took all the young women," Bouchard translated quietly. "For labor service," they said. But he didn't need to finish. Everyone knew what labor service often meant for young women in occupied territories. The Nazis had a particular cruelty reserved for civilians who had the misfortune of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Daniel felt something break inside his chest. Marie Dubois. She had a name, a family, a life that had been torn apart by the same war that had brought him to that church. And he had left her there, left her to face whatever came next alone. That night, Daniel sat in his bunk and drew her face again, but this time he wrote her name beneath it, Marie Dubois. He tried to capture not just her features, but her spirit, the quiet strength he'd seen in her eyes, even in the face of abandonment. He worked by lamplight, adding details from memory, trying to honor the person she had been rather than just the face he'd glimpsed. The war ended in May 1945, but Daniel's personal war was just beginning. While his unit celebrated victory in Europe, he found himself consumed by a different kind of mission. He had to know what had happened to Marie Dubois. Using his position as a military artist, Daniel managed to get assigned to the Allied efforts to document war crimes and locate displaced persons. It was legitimate work. The Army needed artists to record the evidence of Nazi atrocities for future tribunals. But for Daniel, it was also a cover for his private search. He returned to the Belgian village where he'd last seen Marie, now liberated but bearing the scars of occupation. The church was still standing, though the damage was worse than he remembered. Someone had boarded up the broken windows, and weeds grew through cracks in the stone floor. He found Marie's grandparents still living in the village, though they seemed to have aged decades in the months since he'd last seen them. They welcomed him with the careful hospitality of people who had learned to be wary of soldiers, regardless of their uniform. "You knew Marie?" the old woman asked in halting English when Daniel showed her his sketches. "Briefly," Daniel replied. "I was there when she came to the church. I wanted to help her, but we had to retreat." The old man nodded gravely. "You could do nothing. The Germans, they came that night. They took all the young women, said they needed workers for the factories in Germany." "Do you know where she was taken?" Daniel asked. The couple exchanged glances. "We heard rumors," the old woman said. "Some said a camp near Munich. Others said a factory in the Ruhr Valley. But after the war, when the lists were published," she shook her head. "So many lists, so many names. We never found hers." Daniel spent 3 days in the village, interviewing survivors, documenting their stories, and searching for any trace of Marie's fate. But the war had scattered lives like leaves in a storm, and many of those leaves had never settled anywhere that could be found. He showed Marie's sketch to everyone he met, hoping for recognition, for some thread that might lead him to answers. A few people remembered her, a baker's daughter who had been friends with Marie, a shopkeeper who recalled her helping with deliveries. But no one had seen her since the Germans had taken her. On his last day in the village, Daniel was packing his equipment when the baker's daughter approached him with a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "Marie left this with me," she said quietly, "before she went to stay with friends in the village. She said if anything happened to her, I should give it to her family. But maybe you should have it." Daniel unwrapped the cloth to reveal a small leather journal and a charcoal pencil worn down to a stub. Inside the journal were dozens of sketches, portraits of villagers, landscapes of the Belgian countryside, still lives of simple objects transformed by careful observation into something beautiful. Marie had been an artist too. Daniel felt his breath catch as he turned the pages. Her style was different from his, more impressionistic, more emotional, but there was undeniable talent in every line. And on the last page, clearly drawn but never finished, was a sketch of a soldier sitting at a field desk, his face turned away as he worked. She had been drawing him while he was drawing her. Daniel returned to the United States in the fall of 1945, carrying Marie's journal and a growing collection of his own sketches of her face. He enrolled at the Art Institute of Chicago on the GI Bill, determined to turn his wartime experience into something meaningful. But every canvas he started seemed to demand the same subject: the young woman he'd met for 5 minutes in a broken church. His professors were puzzled by his obsession with a single subject. "You have talent, Harper," said Professor Kellerman, his painting instructor, "but you're limiting yourself. Art is about expanding your vision, not narrowing it." But Daniel couldn't explain that painting Marie wasn't about limiting his vision. It was about clarifying it. Every time he painted her face, he discovered something new about that moment in the church, about the connection he'd felt, about the weight of abandonment that had haunted him since. He painted her in oil, in watercolor, in charcoal, in pastels. He painted her as she had been, young, frightened, beautiful in her vulnerability. He painted her as she might have become, older, perhaps with children of her own, perhaps with the lines of experience softening her features. He painted her as he feared she had ended, hollow-eyed, broken, consumed by the machinery of war. Each painting was an act of remembrance, a way of keeping her alive in a world that had forgotten she ever existed. It was during his third year at the Art Institute that Daniel's work caught the attention of a gallery owner named Samuel Green. Green had seen Daniel's paintings in a student exhibition and was intrigued by the emotional intensity of the portraits. "Who is she?" Green asked, studying Daniel's latest painting, a life-size portrait of Marie as he remembered her from the church, but with added depth and detail that came from years of contemplation. "Someone I met during the war," Daniel replied. "I only knew her for a few minutes, but she changed you." Green finished. "I can see it in the work. There's something here, Daniel. Something that speaks to the human cost of war in a way that statistics never could." Green offered to feature Daniel's Marie portraits in a show called Faces of War, Personal Testimonies in Paint. The exhibition would open in Chicago in the spring of 1949, then travel to New York and possibly Europe. Daniel hesitated. The paintings were deeply personal, born from his own guilt and longing. But Green made a compelling argument. "Art is about communication, Daniel. These paintings say something important about war, about loss, about the individual lives that get lost in the sweep of history. Don't you think she deserves to be seen?" The question haunted Daniel. Did Marie deserve to be seen? Or was he exploiting her memory, turning her tragedy into his artistic success? He spent weeks considering the offer, walking through Chicago's streets with Marie's journal in his pocket, reading her sketches like letters from the past. It was in her drawings that he found his answer. Not in any specific image, but in the cumulative effect of her work. Marie had been trying to capture the world around her, to preserve moments of beauty in the midst of chaos. She had been an artist who understood that bearing witness was itself a form of resistance. Daniel agreed to the exhibition. Faces of War, Personal Testimonies in Paint, opened at the Green Gallery on a rainy April evening in 1949. The centerpiece was Daniel's collection of Marie portraits, 12 paintings that traced his evolving understanding of the young woman he'd met in a Belgian church. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Critics praised the emotional honesty of the work, the way Daniel had transformed a brief encounter into a meditation on war's human cost. But it was the public reaction that truly surprised him. Veterans came to the gallery and stood silently before the paintings, recognizing in Marie's face all the civilian casualties they had failed to save. Families who had lost loved ones saw in her portrait their own questions about the fate of missing relatives. Art students studied Daniel's technique, trying to understand how he had captured such depth of emotion in a face he had known for only minutes. But it was the letter that arrived 3 weeks after the opening that changed everything. "Dear Mr. Harper," it began, written in careful English with a slight accent evident in the word choices. "I am writing to you about your paintings of the young woman in the church. I believe she may have been my sister." Daniel's hands trembled as he read the letter. It was from a woman named Claire Dubois, writing from Montreal, Canada. She had seen a review of the exhibition in a newspaper and recognized something in the photographs of Daniel's paintings. "Marie was my younger sister," the letter continued. "She was staying with friends in Belgium when the Germans advanced. We were separated during the evacuation, and I never saw her again. I've been searching for her since the war ended, but there are so many missing persons, so many lists that lead nowhere." Claire explained that she had managed to escape to England during the early days of the occupation, had worked for the French resistance from London, and had immigrated to Canada after the war. She had never stopped looking for Marie, had never stopped hoping that somehow her sister had survived. "Your paintings," Claire wrote, "they capture something that could only come from having known her. The way she held her head when she was afraid but trying to be brave. The way she looked at people when she was deciding whether to trust them. Could we please meet? I need to know what happened to her." Daniel arranged to meet Claire in Montreal the following week. The train journey north gave him time to organize his thoughts, to prepare for a conversation he had been unconsciously rehearsing for 4 years. Claire met him at the station, and Daniel recognized her immediately. She had the same dark hair as Marie, the same expressive eyes, though hers were marked by years of worry and loss. They went to a small cafe near the station, where Claire studied Daniel's face with the intensity of someone searching for answers. "Tell me about her," Claire said simply. Daniel told her everything. About finding Marie in the church, about the sketch he had drawn for her, about the evacuation and his years of searching afterward. He showed her Marie's journal, which he had brought with him, and watched Claire's face transform as she recognized her sister's handwriting. She was always drawing, Claire said, tears streaming down her face as she turned the pages. Even as a child, she saw things differently than the rest of us. She could find beauty in the most ordinary moments. "What happened to her?" Daniel asked gently. Claire's expression darkened. "I found some records through the Red Cross. She was taken to a factory near Munich, forced to work in munitions production. The conditions were terrible. Many of the women didn't survive. But you don't know for certain?" "The factory was bombed by the Allies in March 1945, Claire said quietly, 2 months before the war ended. There are no survivors listed, but there were also no complete casualty records. Some women were transferred to other facilities before the bombing, but there's no way to know if Marie was among them." Daniel felt the weight of uncertainty settle over him like a shroud. After all his searching, all his painting, all his attempts to keep Marie's memory alive, he still didn't know her fate. She remained suspended in that moment of abandonment, forever waiting in a broken church for salvation that might never come. "Your paintings," Claire said suddenly, "they're not just about Marie. They're about all the women like her, all the people who were lost in the war. You've given her a voice, a presence in the world. That matters." Daniel returned to Chicago with a new understanding of his artistic mission. The Marie portraits continue to travel, appearing in galleries across the United States and Europe. Each exhibition drew crowds of people who recognized in her face their own losses, their own questions about the fate of loved ones who had vanished into the chaos of war. But the most significant response came from an unexpected source. In 1951, Daniel received a letter from a woman named Sister Catherine, who worked with displaced persons in a refugee camp in Austria. She had seen the Marie portraits in a Vienna gallery and written to tell Daniel about their impact on the camp's residents. "Your paintings," Sister Catherine wrote, "have given hope to many women here who were separated from their families during the war. They see in Marie's face their own stories, their own strength. But more importantly, they see that someone remembers, someone cares about what happened to them." The letter included a photograph of the camp's recreation hall, where someone had painted a mural inspired by Daniel's portraits. It showed Marie as she appeared in his paintings, but surrounded by dozens of other women, Holocaust survivors, refugees, displaced persons of all kinds. The mural was titled "Those Who Wait," and it had become a focal point for the camp's efforts to help residents process their trauma. Daniel was deeply moved by the photograph. His personal obsession with one lost woman had somehow become a universal symbol of remembrance and hope. But he also felt the weight of responsibility that came with that recognition. He began to expand his work beyond the Marie portraits, creating a series called The Forgotten that featured other faces from the war: prisoners of war, resistance fighters, civilians caught in the crossfire. Each painting was based on a real person Daniel had encountered during his service, each one an attempt to preserve an individual life that might otherwise be lost to history. The series was exhibited internationally and established Daniel as one of the foremost war artists of his generation. But he never forgot that his reputation was built on the foundation of a 5-minute encounter with a young woman whose name he had learned only after leaving her to face an uncertain fate. In 1963, nearly 20 years after the war's end, Daniel received a letter that changed everything once again. It was from a researcher named Dr. Heinrich Müller, who was working on a comprehensive study of Nazi labor camps and their victims. "Dear Mr. Harper," the letter began, "I am writing to you about your paintings of Marie Du Bois, which have become well known through your exhibitions. I believe I may have information about her fate." Dr. Müller explained that he had been interviewing survivors of the Munich munitions factory where Marie had been taken. Most of the women who had worked there had died in the bombing, but a few had been transferred to other facilities in the weeks before the attack. One of the survivors I interviewed, a woman named Greta Hoffman, remembered a young French woman who matched Marie's description. According to Mrs. Hoffman, this woman was an artist who would draw portraits of the other workers on scraps of paper. She said the drawings gave the women hope, reminded them that they were still human beings despite the dehumanizing conditions. Daniel's heart raced as he read the letter. Marie had continued to draw, even in the labor camp. Even in the midst of unimaginable suffering, she had found ways to create beauty, to preserve humanity. Mrs. Hoffman believes that Marie was among a group of women transferred to a smaller facility near the Swiss border in February 1945, Dr. Müller continued. This facility was liberated by American forces in April, and most of the survivors were taken to a displaced persons camp in Geneva. However, many of the women were in poor health, and some died in the weeks following liberation. The letter included copies of liberation records from the Geneva camp, lists of names that had been compiled by Allied forces trying to reunite families. Daniel scanned the pages frantically, looking for any mention of Marie Du Bois. And there it was, near the bottom of the fourth page. Marie Du Bois, age 22, French national, admitted to camp hospital April 15, 1945. Condition: severe malnutrition, pneumonia. Status: deceased April 23, 1945. Daniel stared at the entry for a long time, feeling a complex mixture of grief and relief. Marie had survived the factory bombing, had lived to see liberation, but had died just weeks before the war's end. She had been so close to freedom, so close to reunion with her family. But there was more. Dr. Müller had included a final paragraph that made Daniel's breath catch. Mrs. Hoffman also mentioned that Marie had spoken of an American soldier who had drawn her portrait in a Belgian church. She said Marie had carried this drawing with her throughout her imprisonment, that it had given her hope that someone in the world remembered her name. The drawing was found among her possessions when she died and was buried with her in the camp cemetery. Daniel traveled to Geneva in the summer of 1963, carrying with him a completed portrait of Marie, not as he had imagined her in his paintings, but as she had actually been in that church, young and frightened and beautiful in her vulnerability. It was the most honest work he had ever created, stripped of the romanticization that had characterized his earlier paintings. The camp cemetery was a small, peaceful place overlooking Lake Geneva. Most of the graves were marked with simple wooden crosses, though some had been replaced with stone markers by families who had eventually found their loved ones' resting places. Marie's grave was in the third row, marked with a cross that bore her name and dates. Marie Du Bois, 1923 to 1945, Elle n'est pas oubliée. She is not forgotten. Daniel knelt beside the grave and placed his latest portrait against the headstone. For the first time in 18 years, he was able to say goodbye to the young woman who had haunted his dreams and inspired his art. "I'm sorry I couldn't save you," he whispered. "I'm sorry I left you in that church." But as he spoke the words, Daniel realized they were no longer true. He hadn't saved Marie from her fate, but he had saved her from obscurity. Through his paintings, her face had been seen by thousands of people, her story had been told, her humanity had been preserved. The sketch he had drawn for her in the church had given her hope during her darkest moments. The portraits he had painted of her had given hope to countless others who had faced similar losses. Art had become the bridge between memory and meaning, between individual tragedy and universal understanding. As Daniel stood to leave, he noticed a small bouquet of daffodils on the grave next to Marie's. The flowers were fresh, suggesting that someone still visited regularly to honor the dead. He realized that Marie's story was not unique, that all around the world, people were still searching for answers about loved ones lost in the war, still finding ways to keep their memories alive. But Marie's story was also special because it had been witnessed, recorded, and shared. Because a young soldier had taken 5 minutes to see her as an individual human being rather than just another casualty of war. Because art had the power to transform a moment of abandonment into a legacy of remembrance. Daniel returned to Chicago with a new understanding of his artistic mission. The Marie portraits continued to travel and inspire, but he began to focus more on teaching, on passing on the lessons he had learned about the power of art to preserve human dignity in the face of tragedy. He established a scholarship program at the Art Institute for students who wanted to use their talents to document social issues and human rights abuses. He worked with refugee organizations to help displaced persons tell their stories through art. He created a series of workshops called Bearing Witness that taught artists how to approach difficult subjects with sensitivity and respect. But perhaps most importantly, Daniel began to write. He published a memoir called The Soldier Who Painted Her Face that told the complete story of his encounter with Marie and the decades-long journey it had set in motion. The book became a bestseller and was translated into dozens of languages, reaching an even wider audience than his paintings had. The memoir caught the attention of filmmakers, and in 1975, a documentary about Daniel's story was nominated for an Academy Award. The film included interviews with Claire Du Bois, Dr. Mueller, and several of the displaced persons who had been inspired by Daniel's work. But the most powerful moment in the documentary came when the cameras followed Daniel to Geneva, where he visited Marie's grave for the final time. He was older now, his hair white and his hands less steady, but his commitment to her memory remained unwavering. "I've spent 30 years trying to understand what happened in that church," he told the camera as he stood beside Marie's grave. "I thought I was painting her face, but I was really painting the face of war itself. The way it tears families apart, the way it leaves people forgotten, the way it challenges us to remember what it means to be human." He paused, looking out over the peaceful cemetery toward the lake beyond. Marie Du Bois was one person among millions who suffered in that war. But she was also unique, irreplaceable, deserving of being remembered. That's what art is for, to remind us that statistics have faces, that history is made up of individual lives, that every person matters. Daniel Harper died in 1987 at the age of 67. His final painting, completed just weeks before his death, was a portrait of Marie as she might have appeared if she had lived to grow old. Her hair silver, her face lined with experience, but her eyes still holding that same mixture of vulnerability and strength that had first captured his attention in a Belgian church. The painting hangs today in the Daniel Harper Memorial Gallery at the Art Institute of Chicago, surrounded by his complete collection of Marie portraits and other works from his Forgotten series. The gallery has become a pilgrimage site for families of Holocaust victims, veterans dealing with PTSD, and anyone seeking to understand the human cost of war. But perhaps the most fitting tribute to Daniel's legacy is the letter that arrived at the gallery in 1995, 50 years after the war's end. It was from a young woman named Marie Claire Du Bois-Shun, who identified herself as the granddaughter of Claire Du Bois, Marie's sister. "I am writing to thank you for preserving my great-aunt's memory," the letter began. "I have grown up with Daniel Harper's paintings of Marie, and they have taught me that art has the power to keep love alive across time and distance." The letter went on to explain that Marie Claire was herself an artist, working with refugee communities in Los Angeles to help them process trauma through creative expression. She had been inspired by Daniel's example to use her talents in service of those who had been forgotten by history. "My great-aunt Marie died alone in a refugee camp, but she was not forgotten," the letter concluded. Through Daniel's paintings, she has touched thousands of lives, inspired countless acts of compassion, and reminded us all that every person has a story worth telling. That is the true power of art, not just to create beauty, but to create meaning from suffering, to transform tragedy into hope. The letter was signed simply, Marie Claire Du Bois-Shun, artist and granddaughter of survivors. And so the story continues, rippling outward through generations like circles on a pond. The soldier who painted her face but never knew her name had created something far greater than he could have imagined. A legacy of remembrance that would outlive them both, a testament to the power of art to preserve human dignity in the face of unimaginable loss. In the end, Daniel Harper had learned that knowing someone's name was less important than recognizing their humanity. That 5 minutes of connection could last a lifetime. That art had the power to transform abandonment into remembrance, fear into hope, and individual tragedy into universal understanding. Marie Du Bois had been one young woman in a broken church, but through Daniel's paintings, she had become something more, a symbol of all those who had been lost, a reminder that every life matters, and a promise that love, once witnessed and recorded, can never truly die. The last love letter written in Morse code may have been decoded, but the portrait painted in a moment of abandonment continues to speak, continues to inspire, continues to remind us that some faces, once seen, can never be forgotten. And in galleries around the world, Marie Du Bois still waits, not for rescue, but for recognition, not for salvation, but for remembrance, not for her name to be known, but for her humanity to be witnessed. She is not forgotten. She never will be. Some memories are more vivid than the present. Some faces haunt us not because we knew them, but because we almost did. And sometimes, the briefest encounter can change not just one life, but countless others, rippling forward through time like a stone thrown into still water.